And for those who join us online, I am glad that you're able to do that as well. I'm thankful for this method, and I want to encourage you, as you have opportunity, join us in person. I wander around the room a little bit, and the camera might miss me. The people in the room, however, don't, because I'm not hard to spot. Glad you're here as well. Exodus chapter 1. No problem, I'm glad you're here. The two most powerful macro, thinking large scale, the two most powerful things in the universe, and it's not close. Number one is extraordinarily more powerful than number two, but number two is nothing to mess with. Number one is the expressed will of the living God. Anything in creation that tries to get in front of that will get smashed, will get run over. God is utterly sovereign over all of his creation. In distant second, but still extraordinarily formidable, is the law of averages. The law of averages is powerful. If you take a quarter and flip it 100 times and get more than a 3 or 4% difference than 50 heads and 50 tails, you've got a defective quarter, or there's something wrong with your flipping technique. The law of averages is formidable. Doubt it? And I checked myself on this, so I know I'm right. An American standard roulette wheel has 38 slots. They are numbered 1 through 36, and then there's the green 0 and the green 00 for a total of 38. But those who play roulette, when they win based on a statistical model wherein the wheel has 36 spots. For example, of those 38 spots, 18 are black and 18 are red. So if you bet red or black, you get paid 1 to 1, as though half the wheel is red and half the wheel is black, but they're not, because of those two greens. When they built the Bellagio in Las Vegas, it cost $1 billion. And that's because the law of averages gets them paid. The law of averages provides $1 billion to build this massive resort. I'm oversimplifying, but I'm not wrong. It's built on what's lost by people who think they can beat the law of averages. And maybe you can for a second. Maybe if I hand you a 6-sided die. If I hand you a 6-sided die, let me see. 6, 36, 180 plus 36, 216. If I offer you $150 if you can roll a 3 times in a row, and you take it, you're a sucker. I would need to pay you $216 to roll 3 times in a row, if you're going to pay me $1 to play. I'll take $1 and pay you back $150 if, with an honest dice that I provide for you, I'm not trying to set up a casino, because I have, second only to my faith in the living God, the law. I know the law of averages to be extraordinarily reliable. What has this to do with Exodus 1? That's a super fair question. Here's the deal. when you see the law of averages getting stomped on by spectacularly unlikely events. The law of averages is the second most powerful force in the universe. When you see it getting beaten like a drum, what should you suspect is beating it? What's beating number 2? Number 1! I could say ask Alabama, but I'll refrain. Don't want to create any partisanship in the room. God is at work when spectacularly unlikely things start happening. When spectacularly unlikely things start happening, look for the hand of God. My outline tonight is a two-point outline. First, I want to talk to you about an unlikely enemy. And then I want to talk to you about an unlikely hero. So Roman numeral 1, the context of God's deliverance, an unlikely enemy. To understand where we are when the curtain goes up on Exodus 1, we have to remember some things from the latter part of Genesis. Genesis and Exodus abut. It's not always the case. Have you ever attempted to read the chronological narrative of the Old Testament? You'll find fairly quickly that the books are out of order, especially as you get on in. Not the case with Genesis Exodus. Genesis Exodus can be read as one continuous story. Toward the end of the book of Genesis, and if you were here for our study of the life of Joseph, this is review. Joseph, an Israelite from Israel, was sold into slavery by his brothers. His father treated him like a favorite. His brothers resented it. They beat him up, threw him down a well, faked his death to his father. Kind of, sort of decided that wasn't the best thing to do to their brother, so instead they sold him to a slave caravan. He ends up in Egypt, sold into slavery in Egypt. Through a series of spectacularly unlikely events, he ends up as the prime minister of the nation of Egypt. And if you say, whoa, that's a great story, it's in the book of Genesis. I commend it to you. It's a fantastic story. It happened, by the way. It's fantastic history. So Joseph, as prime minister of Egypt, becomes aware, or is aware, through a dream he interprets for the Pharaoh, that a massive famine is coming, but it's coming right behind a season of abundance. So Joseph, in his wisdom, is given the assignment, you manage the season of abundance so that we get through the famine. And in order that you do that, Pharaoh said, I'm going to make you my right-hand guy. The only thing I will own is the stuff that only Pharaoh can do. Everything else, your deal. Joseph's family comes to Egypt to get food. And again, through another series of spectacularly unlikely events, they end up meeting Joseph personally. Caravans from all over the world were coming to Egypt for food. It is not likely that they would meet Joseph in person, but they did. There's a reunion. And Joseph is interested in providing for his family, his brothers, his fellow descendants of his father Jacob. In effect, the nation of Israel. Jacob's name, remember, was changed to Israel. He wants to provide them a place in Egypt. Joseph is explaining the plan to his family. Let me go back to Genesis 45, verses 8 through 20. So it was not you who sent me here, Joseph is speaking to his family, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh. Apparently Pharaoh was a youngish man. He's made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father. That is, go get Jacob, and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord over all of Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry, and you shall dwell in the land of Goshen. That is a piece of real estate, nice real estate, inside Egypt. And you shall be near me, you and your children, and your children's children, and your flocks, and your herds, and all that you have. And there I will provide for you, for there are yet 5 years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have do not come to poverty. Now your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see, that it is my mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father of all the honor in Egypt, and of all that has been seen. Hurry and bring my father down here. And then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept upon his neck, and he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them, and after that his brothers talked with him. And when the report was heard in Pharaoh's house, Joseph's brothers have come, it pleased Pharaoh and his servants. Pharaoh was looking for opportunities to reward Joseph because he was so tickled with the excellence of Joseph's service. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, say to your brothers, do this, load your beasts and go back to the land of Canaan, and take your father and your households and come to me, and I will give you the best of the land of Egypt. And you shall eat of the fat of the land. And you, Joseph, are commanded to say, do this. Take wagons from the land of Egypt for your little ones and for your wives, and bring your father and come. Have no concern for your goods, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. Now, there are other passages between there and the end of the book. There's even when Jacob eventually dies in Egypt, Joseph's father, a bunch of the Egyptian court go back up to Israel for his funeral. There's a interlocked relationship. The Egyptians are thrilled to honor Joseph by loving the small nation of Israel. Remember, Joseph's brothers are the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. This is the baby nation of Israel. And Egypt is thrilled. Pharaoh is thrilled to welcome them and host them in the land of Egypt. And all is well. Well, except Israel doesn't belong in Egypt. I won't say they aren't supposed to be there, but they are not to be there indefinitely. I'll put it like this. I won't say they're not supposed to be there, but I will say they're supposed to leave. They have the land of Israel. They have the promised land of Canaan that God has given them. And while Goshen has its advantages, it's not to be their home. And so one anticipates a movement of the hand of God to get his people back to the zip code where they're supposed to be. But they're the honored, welcomed, settled, celebrated guests of, at that time, the world's only superpower. An unlikely enemy. Now we're ready to go to Exodus. Letter A. From host to hostile. From host to hostile. Verses 1 through 14. The book of Exodus and the book of Genesis were both written by the same human author, Moses. Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament according to Jesus. Have an argument with that, take it up with him. Modern scholarship would sometimes disagree. Imagine that, modern experts who get it wrong. Glad we have no experience with that. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. Israel and Jacob are the same people, the same guy. These are the sons of Jacob who came to Egypt with Jacob, he's saying. Each with his household, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceeding strong, so that the land was filled with them. Over the years, as they were at peace and at ease and in plenty in the land of Goshen, they flourished, and the population grew greatly. Verse 8 is a pivotal verse. It is an absolutely pivotal. It's one of those verses that you would do well to highlight or underline. It's one of those verses that marks a turning point in the narrative. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Now, centuries have passed. There have been various kings that don't know Joseph. The idea here is finally we come to a Pharaoh who neither knows nor remembers nor has any particular concern for the story of Joseph. How could that happen? I do an exercise with my high school students just, in fact, this week. We did it with this class of seniors. And it's a worthwhile exercise. So I'll put you through it. I won't make you stand up like I make them stand up. But I will ask you, raise your hand if you could, and if you don't have two parents because of extraordinary circumstances, forgive me, I'm not seeking to pick on you. Most of us have two parents, either adopted or biological. If you could name both your parents, if you would, raise your hand. I'm not going to make you do it. Just, okay. Good. All right. If you could name your 4 grandparents, put your hand up. I'm still in, by the way. I can name the first and last names of my 4 grandparents. Good. If you could name the first and last names of your 8 great-grandparents, raise your hand. This is where I find out who the genealogy hobbyists are. Genealogy hobbyists? Yeah. Apart from being a genealogy hobbyist, there's almost nobody. They lived less than 100 years ago. In their time, they were a big deal. They might have been around for the first manned flight at Kitty Hawk and for the first space flight, in the early 60s, late 50s. They for most of us in the room, at the great-grandparent level, they have vivid participation in World War I or II, depending on the generational spread between us and them. They were the generation for the first half of the 20th century. And we can't remember their names. It's been 4 centuries since a pharaoh said, Joseph, let me just give you everything I can think to give you. I'm keeping my chair for myself. I'm keeping my chariot for myself. But I'm going to give you everything I can think to give you. And we sit and we go, how can there have arisen a pharaoh that doesn't remember the Joseph narrative? And yet we don't remember the great-grandparent narrative unless we've put together the names through genealogical hobbyism. Hobbyism? Hobbyism. I can make that word up. Words come from somewhere. He doesn't know Joseph, and he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. We have an enemy within, and there's a bunch of them. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They, these now newly enslaved Israelites, built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. I love verse 12. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. The more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. And the more they spread abroad. Under this letter A, from host to hostile, I have two things I've written in my notes explicitly. The first is oppression led to fruitfulness. Oppression led to fruitfulness. There really seems to be, in the long history of the narrative of God's faithful people, Israel in the Old Testament as God's faithful people at their best, and the church in the large sense in our era. There really does seem to be some correlation, and I'm not fond of oppression, but there really seems to be some correlation between oppression and fruitfulness. We certainly see that here, explicitly see it here. Second thing we see is that fear leads to ruthlessness. I'm going to deal with the Israelites harshly because I'm scared to death of them. So they ruthlessly, verse 13, so they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. And in all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Well, that's a big change from where we left things at the end of Genesis, when a group of Pharaoh's top court officials traveled up to Canaan to dance at the funeral, to dance in mourning at the funeral of Jacob. And now, ruthless enslavement, from host to hostile. Letter B, attempted murder by midwife. Attempted murder by midwife, verses 15 through 21. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, Swindoll makes the point, by the way, we don't have any certain archaeology. We don't have an artifact that tells us what a Hebrew birth stool from this period looked like. You could take the word birth stool and make all kinds of fascinating inferences and guesses. Don't have any idea. But it is a word that doesn't need further defining, right? It's some sort of piece of furniture that allows a mom who is giving birth to assume a posture that facilitates the giving of birth. Have no idea. Nobody's ever dug up, this must be a Hebrew birth stool, at any rate. If it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it's a daughter, she shall live. He makes this murderous decree. By the way, I think it was Kerry that said in his message Sunday, sometimes we wish we had the tone of voice. You know, I wish we had audio. Not that I understand ancient Egyptian. It's very easy to reduce Pharaoh here to sort of a comic opera villain, twirling his mustache and tying damsels to the railroad tracks sort of person, you know? But I bet not. I don't know about you, but the moments in my life when I have encountered the most extraordinary evil usually cloaks itself in sweet reasonableness. Ladies, I think you would agree with me that you perform an important service. We're glad you're here. You would agree with me that the Egyptians and the Israelites have a long and mutually beneficial relationship. Right now, it might be a little lopsided, but you do get to eat those leeks and onions from time to time. We know that from later in the story, right? I have something to ask of you. And I hope you won't think it's a big deal. There are just too many little Israelite boys running around. So here's what I'd like you to do. The girls are fine. We like the little Israelite girls, more power to them. But I'm going to need you to kill the boys. You understand that, don't you? It reminds me of Nebuchadnezzar with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Maybe you didn't understand the first time, so I'm going to go over it with you again. When you hear the music and everybody drops to their knees in front of my statue, I'm going to need you to do that too. Evil does not wear a black cape and flap it around and have a big nose with a wart on it and cackle. Evil is reasonable. The clearest justification for civil disobedience that one could ever have is when one is directed to commit murder. So these midwives take a pass. Verse 17. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them. But they let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and let the male children live?" I like their subterfuge. The midwives said to Pharaoh, the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. The implication being, the Egyptian women, they take all day to have a kid. But the Hebrew women, made of sterner stuff, they're vigorous. And they give birth before the midwife comes. By the time we get there, the birth's already happened. We're not able to follow through with the execution of the newborn males in the so efficient way and so reasonable way you've asked us to do. We just can't seem to pull it off. God dealt well with the midwives. And the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Now that phrase, Swindoll says, is also a little bit of an enigma. The easiest way to read it is to say he gave those midwives themselves a bunch of kids of their own. I can be very content with that. At the very least, we know that God blessed them for their declining to participate in the order to kill people. So we've gone from host to hostile in letter A. Letter B, we've talked about attempted murder by midwife. Letter C, the order for genocide by gender. Verse 22. Pharaoh decided to stop beating around the bush about it. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, let's get the Egyptian population in on this, so that it gets done. Every son that is born to the Hebrews, you shall cast it into the Nile. Throw the baby boys in the river. You shall let every daughter live. I raised sons. Some of y'all raised daughters, some of y'all raised both, but I raised sons. My first grandchild is a boy. He turned 2 back in November. I have nothing at all against little baby girls. In fact, my second grandchild, whose name, if Levi and Avery know her name, they're not telling us yet. They let us in on the gender, which I thought was kind. That way I've been praying for baby girl, who's due in a little over a month. I can't wait to meet her. Levi and Avery are fantastic parents. I shudder. This is not a cold, sterile, arm's length story. This is little boys getting thrown in the river. This is little boys who ought to be sitting on the floor and going vroom, vroom with their toy trucks. Okay, maybe not toy trucks in ancient Egypt, but whatever they would have had. They're getting thrown in the river. And Israel and Egypt. Close friends, not that many centuries back. Honored, invited guests. Now a spectacularly and horribly unlikely thing has happened. Now they're genocidal enemies. So, Roman numeral 2. If Roman numeral 1 is the context of God's deliverance through this unlikely enemy, Roman numeral 2 is the conduit, that through which God's deliverance will flow, an unlikely hero. An unlikely hero. And okay, spoiler alert. Here's what I'm about to talk us through verses 1 through 10 of chapter 2. And here's what we're going to see happen. We're going to go from an obscure baby boy born under the explicit threat of death, one of any number of little baby boy Egyptians born to nondescript parents in a nondescript setting, remarkable only because of the active death threat that descends upon him the moment his gender is known. In this small little dwelling, in this obscure little corner, that's where we start. We're going to get him to being the adopted son, the adopted grandchild of the mightiest ruler on earth, the hyper-privileged adopted grandson of the mightiest ruler on earth. From there to there in 10 verses. You can't make this stuff up. If this were a work of fiction, the editor would write a note to the author saying, this is too weird for your reader to ever even identify with. You know, to write good fiction, you have to kind of ground your story. It's annoying. I don't know about you. It's annoying to me when I read a novel and I feel like the author has cheated. You know, you write your protagonist into a corner for 12 chapters, and then in the 13th chapter you magically create the solution where everything works out great. That annoys me. I feel like the author is lazy. I feel like the author has cheated. If this weren't a true story, I'd feel that way about the progression from verses 1 through 10. It's too crazy. It's too unlikely. It is such a defiance of the law of averages It must be the hand of God. Let's walk through it. I see 6 steps. So I won't A, B, C, D, E, F this. I'll 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 it. First step, we meet a beautiful baby. A beautiful baby. You say, well, Pastor Russell, all babies are beautiful. Look, it's just us and whoever's watching. Can we admit Dr. R.G. Lee, the longtime pastor of the Bellevue Baptist Church in Memphis, is credited with being the first pastor to ever publicly admit this. He said publicly, you know, you go to the hospital to meet the newborn. Sometimes there have been forceps involved, and so you got a little conical head. And sometimes the color's not just right yet if the baby's just been born, and, you know. So what he developed when introduced to the newborn, and they would say, isn't he or she the most beautiful ever? You know what he always said? He always said, wow, that's a baby. Yeah. But in this case, we see that he was a fine boy. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. It's not even the ruling tribe. The ruling tribe has been revealed already in the book of Genesis as being the tribe of Judah. So whoever's coming is not going to be a legitimate king. He's something else. The Levite tribe is the tribe of the priests. Levite guy married Levite girl. And the woman conceived and bore a son. Now we know from just a couple of verses that's a death sentence. That's a death sentence. Every single Egyptian person has been charged to be on the lookout for the birth of a little boy. She bore a son, and when she saw he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. There are parents in the room who have recently enough remembered that chapter of their parenting that you can recall what it's like to get a little one from birth to 3 months. I honestly, in Philip and Kyle's case, I have a slideshow that I can think through, but I don't vividly remember the experience. I remember sleeplessness and noise. That's what I remember. Often the noise contributing to the sleeplessness. How can he be crying already? Kyle especially. He was noisy and demanding at 2 a.m. How do you hide a baby for 3 months? What a matter-of-fact statement the Lord has given us in His Word. And if you read fast, you can read right over it. Zero to 3 months is not a hideable age. It's a noisy age. It's a supply-heavy age. It's a, can we at least show him to his grandparents age. They managed to hide the little guy for 3 months. A beautiful baby. Number 2, a masterful maneuver. A masterful maneuver. I blame Cecil B. DeMille. Cecil B. DeMille has the moment where mom takes the baby in the basket down to the river and sort of shoves him out into the current of the Nile, and the current of the Nile takes the little fellow away wherever it will. That's not what happened. That's not even really close to what happened. Oh, it's got some of the basket in the river. But look at what she actually did. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She tarred a little basket to make it watertight. And she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds. She did not shove it out into the current. She placed it. She very deliberately set it in a very deliberate spot among the reeds near the bank of the river. Among the reeds by the riverbank. It might be out in some shallow water. The riverbank would not have been a sharp drop-off. It would have been an incline, and the reeds would be growing in there, and the reeds would hold the basket in place. So she placed the basket in a particular place among the reeds, and the reeds would have held the basket in place. That's my point. She is not sacrificing her son to some pagan river god. She is not shoving her child out into the current on a wing and a prayer, to mix the metaphors. She's being extraordinarily deliberate. I call it a masterful maneuver. Number 3, a smart sister. We'll see it in verse 4 and again in verse 7. Moses' big sister. We come to know her name to be Miriam. Verse 4. After the little one is placed, and by the way, you notice we don't have his name yet. His name comes from his adopted Egyptian mother, long about verse 10. Here, baby boy has been placed by mom among the reeds by the side of the river. Verse 4, his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Okay, hold that. We'll come back to her in verse 7. On my notes, I have a smart sister, verses 4 and 7, not 4 through 7. Miriam pops up in verse 4. She's going to wait around to see. Verse 7, she's going to show us how really smart she is. Number 4, a perceptive princess. A perceptive princess. Now again, it is my position, and Swindoll is with me, that mom has deliberately placed Moses. She has not randomly, well, he's going to die anyway, I'll just trust him to the river. No. She knows something about that particular spot by the bank of the river among the reeds. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. While her young women walked beside the river, she saw the basket among the reeds. Let me ask you something. Is it reasonable to think that the daughter of the all-powerful, well, in human terms, the quite powerful ruler of the mightiest nation along the Nile, in fact, in the world as it would be perceived from a Middle Eastern worldview, the world's mightiest ruler, his daughter likes to go down to the Nile to bathe? Is it reasonable to say she could pretty well go wherever she wants to along the bank of the Nile? Or do you think, no, you can't go over there, you have to, she would reasonably go wherever she wants to along the bank of the Nile, right? Think like a human being. Remember, these are people. Is it also reasonable to think over time she'd develop a favorite spot? Gail and I are not beach people. The amazing Southwest Florida beaches are kind of wasted on us. One of the occupational hazards, Gail and I are not always seen together. If you're in the 8 o'clock service on Sunday mornings, you'd see me and Gail together pretty often if you're in that service or in our life group. Gail's pigment is not beach friendly. She's very, very, very light-skinned. Her hair really is that color. And she will go from 0 to burned badly very, very quickly. I grew up a block and a half from the ocean, from coming home from the hospital till I was a 5th grader. If I never, ever, ever for the rest of my life get sand in my shoes to annoy me, I'll be okay with that. I'm just not a beachy person. But if you are, and if you've lived here a while, I bet you have a favorite beach. I bet when you say to your people you go to the beach with, you want to go to the beach? You might sometimes mix it up and say, well, which beach? But probably when you say, let's go to the beach, everybody in your circle knows what beach you mean, because you got your spot. I think the princess had her spot. Further, I think Moses' mama knew where that spot was. I think Moses' sister knew where that spot was. I think the placement of the baby was very, very deliberate, not only to not shove him out into the current, but to set up, what is that over there? At the very spot along the Nile where the princess would be prone to go. You say, Brother Russell, that's a lot of speculation. Oh, I admit that. I admit that, but I think if you read the narrative, I think it's quite reasonable speculation. There seems to be a deliberate, certainly a sovereign God is moving deliberately. That's undeniable. But to give credit where it's due, I think Moses' family is moving deliberately too. And it gets even better. This perceptive princess, she spots the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. And when she opened it, she saw the child. And behold, the baby was crying. Well, of course he was. She took pity on him. On him. Seems to imply that somewhere early in her meeting the little one, she decided to determine whether it's a little boy or it's a little girl. And by the way, babies only come in those 2 flavors, for what it's worth. And she said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Now, you think she knew about her daddy's directive regarding male Hebrew children? You think she knew that? Or do you think somehow Daddy's order to kill off all the baby boy Hebrews had missed the attention of his adult daughter? Come on. In this moment, she knows exactly what she's about to become involved in. She does it anyway. This perceptive princess. Come in verse 7 to smart sister, part 2, so to speak. Then his sister, who had been hanging around to see what comes next, said to Pharaoh's daughter, hi, shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew? And this is not nurse in the medical sense. This is nurse in the nanny sense. Someone to nurse this child. Shall I go and call you a nurse from among the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? Hi, princess. That's a baby. Babies have to eat. Maybe I can help. So, wait a minute. God not only miraculously ordains things so that this baby boy born under the threat of death is going to survive. He's going to survive under the political cover, if you will, provided by the princess of the land of Egypt. And during his very little boy years, he's going to be raised by his mom. He's coming right back to Mom. Mom put him in the baskets after lunch. Mom fed him dinner that night. When you see the law of averages getting trampled, God is moving. And the law of averages here is just getting shredded. This is nuts. In a good way. So, number 5, we see a natural nurse. A natural nurse. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go get me somebody. So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you wages. So, okay, let me get this straight. Not only is he not going to be pitched in the Nile to drown, he's going to survive. That's remarkable. Not only is he going to survive, he's going to survive with political cover provided by Pharaoh's daughter. Not only is he going to survive with that kind of political cover, he's going to be raised by his mom. And she's going to get paid to do it. God must indeed intend that this story go to an extraordinary place. Finally, number 6, an auspicious adoption. When the child grew older, at least weaned age, we don't know how much older means. By the time we join again in verse 11, years pass between verse 10 and verse 11. So in verse 10, he's at least to weaning age. Who knows how much older or younger than that, well, not younger, how much older than weaning age he is, but he's older. She, Mama, brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called him Moses, which is, interestingly enough, it's a perfectly Egyptian-sounding name, but it's a pun, because the word Moses sounds a bit like the Hebrew word to draw out. There's nothing. She did not name him Jacob Shalom. She did not name him something so overtly Jewish as to create a problem for him as he grows up, an adopted Egyptian grandson of the Pharaoh. But she gives him a reasonably Egyptian name that sounds a bit like the Hebrew word for drawing out. She named him Moses because, she said, I drew him out of the water. Every economic advantage, every literary, educational advantage, to this death-threatened little Levite baby. Take away. So often, this is a principal takeaway. And the reason this is so often a principal takeaway is that it's so important to truth. This God who orchestrated all this is omnipotent and omnipresent and omniscient. And his orchestration, while certainly Moses is going to play a very unique role, but the level of sovereignty that God is exercising through this narrative is a level of sovereignty he always exercises. God did not ramp up his intentionality because this is Moses. He applied his intentionality and preserved the narrative for us. But he is the God who who sees and decrees the end from the beginning. He is the God who works all things after the counsel of his own will. And when we say that he's always working for his glory and the good of those who love him, we mean it. And we see it explicitly. We see it stripped to the bone and made visible. All the framework, all the lattice, and all the gears. We see it often enough in biblical narrative. We really are supposed to get the message. That's how he operates. So that's a big takeaway. I don't think I get to teach on the encounter at the burning bush. I think that's, Brother David, I think you get to teach that next week. I think your narrative goes that far. I'm going to steal just a little bit, and then I'll quit. I have actually preached a Christmas Sunday message from God's statements at the burning bush to Moses. Because God at the burning bush says to Moses, I am God. I have seen. I have heard. I know. I have come. If you don't see Christ in the burning bush conversation, the God who's God, who sees, hears, knows, and comes. There's a very big takeaway as God sets up a minor deliverance narrative, biggest in the Old Testament, so that we will be attuned to think in terms of God as deliverer. As his ultimate deliverer comes with the ultimate deliverance narrative. Jesus Christ goes to the cross and dies for our sin. So, I am looking forward to the study of Moses, and I hope you are too. Again, I want to recommend the Swindoll book as a read-along if you're a reading person. I don't think you'd be disappointed in the Swindoll book. All right, just before we go, are there any...